The Nephilim, Children of Angels and Women, Forbidden History, Episode 4. What if everything you've been taught about the origins of humanity is incomplete? What if hidden within the pages of Scripture lies evidence of beings so extraordinary, so terrifying, that entire religious institutions have spent centuries trying to erase their existence from public memory? Tonight, we're diving into one of the most suppressed and controversial passages in all of biblical literature. A story so disturbing that it was deliberately obscured, mistranslated, and stripped from mainstream religious teaching. We're talking about Genesis chapter 6, the forbidden account of the Nephilim, the mysterious union between the sons of God and the daughters of men, and the birth of giants that once walked the earth. This isn't just ancient mythology or primitive folklore. These are detailed records maintained by the earliest scribes, accounts that were considered sacred truth by entire civilizations before being quietly removed from official doctrine. What you're about to discover challenges every assumption about human origins, divine intervention, and the true nature of the beings that shaped our earliest history. The passage we're examining describes creatures of such extraordinary size and power that their very existence threatened to corrupt the entire human bloodline. Beings so dangerous that according to these ancient texts, God himself decided to cleanse the earth through a global flood rather than allow their influence to spread further. But here's what they never taught you in Sunday school. The Hebrew word used to describe these entities, Nephilim, doesn't simply mean giants as most modern translations suggest. It comes from the root word nephal, meaning to fall or to cause to fall. These weren't just large humans, they were the fallen ones, beings whose very existence represented a catastrophic breach between the heavenly and earthly realms. Now, pause for a moment and consider the implications. If these accounts accurately describe real events, real beings, real genetic interference in human development, then our entire understanding of ancient history, human origins, and the relationship between divine and mortal realms needs fundamental revision. The standard narrative taught in seminaries and universities presents this passage as either symbolic poetry or primitive attempts to explain natural phenomena. But what if the truth is far more literal and far more disturbing? What if the systematic suppression of detailed information about these beings represents one of history's most carefully orchestrated cover-ups? Before we dive deeper into this mystery, let me establish the historical and theological context that makes this passage so significant and so controversial. We're dealing with events that allegedly occurred in the earliest chapters of human history, sometime between Adam's creation and Noah's flood. According to the biblical timeline, this represents a period spanning potentially thousands of years when humanity was still in its infancy, when the boundary between the divine and mortal realms was far more permeable than anything we experience today. This was an age when angels walked openly among men, when divine beings interacted directly with human affairs, and when the very genetics of our species were allegedly subject to supernatural intervention. The cultural context becomes even more intriguing when we examine how similar accounts appear across multiple ancient civilizations that had no contact with each other. The Mesopotamians spoke of the Anunnaki, divine beings who descended from heaven to interact with humanity. The Greeks described the Titans, enormous beings of divine origin who ruled the earth before the gods. Hindu texts reference the Asuras, powerful entities who challenged divine authority. Norse mythology tells of the Nephilim as giants who would bring about Ragnarok, the end of the world. These aren't isolated stories or cultural coincidences. They represent a consistent global memory of encounters between human populations and beings of extraordinary size, power, and apparent divine origin. The fact that these accounts persist across cultures separated by thousands of miles and hundreds of years suggests they may preserve historical memories of actual events rather than mere mythological speculation. But here's where the theological controversy becomes most intense. If these accounts describe real supernatural intervention in human genetics, it raises profound questions about the nature of divine sovereignty, human free will, and the extent to which spiritual forces can influence material reality. Traditional Christian theology has struggled with this passage for centuries because it suggests that angels, beings created to serve God, were capable of rebellion so profound that they abandoned their heavenly nature to pursue physical relationships with human women. This challenges fundamental assumptions about angelic nature, divine authority, and the boundaries between spiritual and physical realms. The Jewish tradition has preserved more detailed accounts of these events in texts like the Book of Enoch, which provides extraordinary detail about the names, activities, and ultimate fate of these fallen beings. According to these sources, 200 angels descended to Mount Hermon, bound themselves by oath to carry out their rebellion, and began teaching humanity forbidden knowledge while taking human women as wives. The offspring of these unions, according to these ancient accounts, were beings of enormous size and appetite. They consumed vast quantities of food, eventually turning to cannibalism when natural resources couldn't sustain them. They grew to heights that dwarfed normal humans, possessed supernatural strength, and demonstrated knowledge and abilities that seemed to transcend natural human limitations. But here's what makes this account particularly disturbing from a theological perspective. These beings didn't just represent physical threats to human populations, they represented genetic contamination that threatened to corrupt the entire human bloodline. According to the ancient texts, their influence was spreading so rapidly that pure human genetics were in danger of complete elimination. This explains why the flood narrative takes on such profound significance. It wasn't simply divine judgment against human wickedness in general. It was a surgical intervention to preserve uncorrupted human genetics through Noah's family, while eliminating the hybrid bloodlines that threatened humanity's genetic integrity. The implications become even more profound when we consider that according to these accounts, some of these hybrid bloodlines survived the flood. The Bible itself acknowledges that giants reappeared in the Promised Land, requiring the Israelites to engage in warfare against populations described as descendants of the Nephilim. This raises uncomfortable questions about divine justice, genetic purity, and the extent to which spiritual forces continue to influence human development. If these hybrid bloodlines possessed capabilities that transcended normal human limitations, what happened to those genetic markers? Did they disappear entirely, or do they persist in hidden form within modern populations? Now, let's examine the actual biblical text that has sparked centuries of debate, mistranslation, and deliberate obscuration. Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 through 4, contains some of the most cryptic and controversial language in all of Scripture. The passage begins innocuously enough. When human beings began to increase in number on the earth, and daughters were born to them. This seems straightforward, describing the natural expansion of human population in the generations following Adam and Eve. But then comes the phrase that has puzzled theologians for millennia. The sons of God saw that the daughters of humans were beautiful, and they married any of them they chose. The Hebrew term used here for sons of God is Bene Elohim, a phrase that appears throughout the Old Testament specifically referring to angelic beings rather than human men. In the book of Job, this same term describes angels presenting themselves before God's throne. In the Psalms, it refers to divine beings who worship in heavenly courts. Yet, many modern translations deliberately obscure this meaning, suggesting instead that sons of God refers to the descendants of Seth, Adam's righteous son, intermarrying with the descendants of Cain. This interpretation, while more comfortable for modern theological sensibilities, requires ignoring the consistent biblical usage of this specific Hebrew phrase. The text continues, "The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God went to the daughters of humans and had children by them. They were the heroes of old, men of renown." Here, we encounter the term that has been systematically mistranslated and misunderstood for centuries. Nephilim, as I mentioned earlier, doesn't simply mean giants. The root word nephil carries connotations of falling, causing to fall, or those who have fallen. These were beings whose very existence represented a catastrophic disruption of natural order. The phrase, "heroes of old, men of renown," becomes particularly significant when we understand that the Hebrew word for heroes is gibborim, which can also be translated as mighty ones or warriors. These weren't benevolent figures worthy of admiration. They were beings of such power and influence that their reputations echoed through subsequent generations. But perhaps most disturbing is the phrase, "and also afterward." This indicates that the Nephilim didn't disappear entirely with the flood. They reappeared in later generations, suggesting either that some survived the global catastrophe or that the conditions that created them initially were somehow re-established. This interpretation gained support from later biblical passages that describe encounters with giants in the Promised Land. Numbers, chapter 13, describes the Israelite spies reporting, "We saw the Nephilim there, the descendants of Anak come from the Nephilim. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them." The consistency of these accounts across different biblical books, written by different authors over centuries, suggests a persistent tradition preserving memories of encounters with beings of extraordinary size and power. These weren't isolated incidents or exaggerated war stories. They represent systematic documentation of ongoing contact with entities that transcended normal human capabilities. Now, here's where the narrative takes its most controversial turn, one that explains why these accounts have been so systematically suppressed throughout history. The forbidden texts that were excluded from the biblical canon provide far more detailed and disturbing accounts of these events. The Book of Enoch, once considered authoritative scripture by many early Jewish and Christian communities, describes the fallen angels by name, details their specific rebellions, and provides graphic accounts of their interactions with humanity. According to this text, these beings didn't just take human wives, they taught humanity forbidden knowledge that was meant to remain hidden. The text describes how these fallen angels revealed the secrets of metallurgy, warfare, cosmetics, astrology, and magic arts. They showed humans how to make weapons of war, how to manipulate their appearance through artificial means, how to read omens in the stars, and how to practice sorcery and divination. But most significantly, they revealed knowledge about genetic manipulation and hybrid breeding that enabled them to create offspring that combined human and angelic characteristics. These hybrid beings possessed not just extraordinary physical capabilities, but enhanced intelligence, supernatural perception, and abilities that bridge the gap between material and spiritual realms. According to these forbidden accounts, the corruption wasn't limited to genetics. These beings established the foundations of occult practices, mystery religions, and secret societies that would preserve and transmit their forbidden knowledge through subsequent generations. This explains why religious authorities have worked so diligently to suppress these texts and obscure their contents. If these accounts accurately describe real events, they suggest that humanity's earliest technological and spiritual development was guided not by natural evolution or divine revelation, but by rebellious spiritual entities pursuing their own agenda. The implications become even more disturbing when we consider how these forbidden teachings allegedly spread throughout ancient civilizations. The advanced knowledge of astronomy, mathematics, metallurgy, and architecture demonstrated by cultures like ancient Egypt, Mesopotamia, and pre-Columbian America, begins to make sense when viewed through this lens. Were the unprecedented achievements of these civilizations the result of human ingenuity and gradual development, or did they represent the application of knowledge that was never meant to be revealed to humanity? The precision of ancient monuments, the sophistication of astronomical observations, and the advanced understanding of complex mathematical principles all suggest access to information that shouldn't have been available to primitive societies. But the most carefully guarded secret involves the genetic legacy of these hybrid beings. According to the forbidden texts, the Nephilim didn't simply disappear after the flood. Their genetic markers persisted in certain bloodlines, creating populations with enhanced capabilities that transcended normal human limitations. This knowledge has been systematically suppressed because it challenges fundamental assumptions about human equality and suggests that certain populations might carry genetic programming that enables capabilities others cannot access. The political and social implications of acknowledging such differences would fundamentally destabilize modern egalitarian ideologies. Even more controversial is the suggestion that these genetic markers continue to influence human development in ways that remain largely unrecognized by mainstream science. If certain bloodlines carry remnants of this ancient programming, it could explain patterns of exceptional achievement, enhanced intuitive abilities, and what some researchers quietly term supernatural sensitivity within specific populations. The systematic removal of these accounts from mainstream religious doctrine wasn't accidental or arbitrary. It represented a calculated effort to prevent populations from understanding the true nature of their genetic heritage and the spiritual forces that continue to influence human development. As we continue our investigation into this forbidden knowledge, we'll explore how different theological traditions have attempted to interpret these mysterious passages, examine the archaeological evidence that may validate these extraordinary claims, and consider the modern implications of rediscovering truths that powerful institutions have worked for centuries to keep hidden. The story of the Nephilim isn't just ancient history. It's a key to understanding forces that continue to shape human consciousness and capability in ways that most people never imagine. The question isn't whether these accounts describe real events, but whether we're prepared to confront the implications of what they reveal about our origins and our destiny. Stay with us as we dive deeper into the most suppressed knowledge in human history, because what we discover next will challenge everything you thought you knew about the true nature of humanity and the spiritual forces that continue to influence our world in ways that remain largely invisible to modern understanding. The theological interpretations of this passage reveal a fascinating divide that has shaped religious thought for over 2 millennia. 3 primary schools of thought have emerged, each carrying profound implications for how we understand the nature of divine beings, human origins, and the boundaries between spiritual and physical realms. The first interpretation, favored by many modern Christian denominations, suggests that the sons of God were simply the righteous descendants of Seth, Adam's third son, who intermarried with the corrupt descendants of Cain. This view, known as the Sethite theory, emerged primarily during the 4th and 5th centuries when church fathers like Augustine sought to rationalize these troubling passages. But here's the problem with this interpretation. It requires us to ignore the consistent biblical usage of the Hebrew phrase Bene Elohim, which throughout Scripture specifically refers to angelic beings rather than human men. More troubling still, this theory fails to explain why the offspring of such unions would be giants of extraordinary power and renown. If righteous men simply married unrighteous women, why would their children possess supernatural characteristics that distinguish them from all other humans? The second interpretation, preserved in ancient Jewish tradition and early Christian writings, takes the text at face value. The sons of God were indeed angelic beings who abandoned their heavenly nature to pursue physical relationships with human women. This view, supported by texts like the Book of Enoch and referenced by New Testament writers like Jude and Peter, suggests a catastrophic breach of divine order that required supernatural intervention to correct. This interpretation aligns with the original Hebrew text and explains the extraordinary nature of the Nephilim offspring. It also provides a context for why God would resort to global destruction rather than simply punishing human wickedness through more conventional means. If the very genetics of humanity were being corrupted by supernatural interference, drastic measures would be necessary to preserve uncorrupted human bloodlines. The third interpretation, emerging from modern archaeological and anthropological research, suggests these accounts preserve cultural memories of encounters with a separate humanoid species that coexisted with early humans. Some researchers propose that these beings were remnants of earlier evolutionary branches, possibly Neanderthals or other archaic human populations, whose superior size and strength led to their deification in primitive cultures. While this interpretation attempts to ground the accounts in naturalistic explanations, it struggles to address the supernatural elements described in the texts. The beings described in Genesis and related passages possessed capabilities that transcended normal biological parameters, demonstrating knowledge and abilities that seemed to originate from non-physical sources. But here's what makes this debate particularly intense in modern theological circles. The interpretation you accept carries profound implications for fundamental doctrines about the nature of angels, the extent of divine sovereignty, and the reliability of scriptural accounts. If angels are capable of the rebellion described in these passages, it challenges traditional notions of angelic perfection and obedience. If spiritual beings can interact with physical reality to the extent described, it opens possibilities for ongoing supernatural intervention that many modern theologians find uncomfortable. Even more controversial is what these accounts suggest about divine justice and human responsibility. If humanity's corruption resulted from external supernatural influence rather than purely human moral failure, how do we understand concepts like sin, redemption, and divine judgment? The early church fathers wrestled intensely with these questions. Clement of Alexandria, Tertullian, and Justin Martyr all accepted the angelic interpretation as literal truth. They understood these passages as describing real historical events that explain the necessity of Christ's incarnation and redemptive work. But as Christianity became institutionalized and sought acceptance within Roman culture, church leadership began favoring interpretations that seemed less supernatural and more philosophically palatable to educated audiences. The shift toward the Sethite interpretation wasn't based on better biblical scholarship or archaeological evidence. It was a calculated move to make Christian doctrine more acceptable to Greek and Roman intellectual sensibilities. This pattern of theological sanitization continued through the medieval period and into the modern era. Seminary curricula gradually eliminated detailed study of these passages, while popular Christian education focused on more comfortable narratives that didn't challenge conventional assumptions about the nature of reality. Yet the archaeological evidence continues to accumulate in ways that support the more literal interpretations of these ancient accounts. Excavations across the Middle East have uncovered skeletal remains exhibiting characteristics that align remarkably with biblical descriptions of the Nephilim and their descendants. Ancient Mesopotamian sites have yielded remains of individuals measuring between 8 and 12 feet in height, with bone density far exceeding normal human parameters and cranial features, suggesting brain capacities significantly larger than modern humans. These discoveries, while often dismissed or explained away by mainstream archaeology, provide physical validation for the extraordinary claims made in ancient texts. Even more intriguing are the cultural artifacts associated with these remains. Tools, weapons, and architectural elements suggest technological capabilities that shouldn't have existed according to conventional timelines of human development. The sophistication of metallurgy, the precision of astronomical observations, and the complexity of mathematical calculations all point toward access to knowledge that transcended what primitive societies should have possessed. The geographical distribution of these discoveries also aligns with biblical accounts of where these beings were concentrated. Sites in Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and Palestine have produced the most significant finds, corresponding to the regions described in Scripture as inhabited by the descendants of the Nephilim. But here's where the modern implications become most disturbing for established institutions. If these archaeological discoveries validate the biblical accounts, they suggest that human history is far more complex and purposeful than evolutionary narratives propose. The revelation that advanced knowledge and capabilities were introduced into human civilization through supernatural intervention challenges, fundamental assumptions about human progress, technological development, and the sources of ancient wisdom. It suggests that many of humanity's greatest achievements might have originated not from gradual human development, but from forbidden knowledge transmitted by rebellious spiritual entities. This possibility terrifies academic institutions, whose authority depends on maintaining naturalistic explanations for all human development. Universities, museums, and research organizations have systematically suppressed or misinterpreted discoveries that might validate supernatural explanations for ancient achievements. Government agencies have also shown unusual interest in controlling access to information about these discoveries. Archaeological sites that yield anomalous remains are often quickly classified or restricted from public access. Researchers who publish findings that support supernatural interpretations of ancient texts frequently find their funding terminated and their careers sabotaged. The pattern extends beyond academic suppression into active disinformation campaigns. Media outlets consistently ridicule or dismiss evidence for the literal interpretation of these biblical passages, while promoting alternative explanations that preserve materialistic worldviews. But perhaps most significantly, religious institutions themselves have become complicit in this suppression campaign. Rather than defending the supernatural elements of their own scriptures, many denominations have adopted interpretations that eliminate anything that might seem primitive or unscientific to modern audiences. This theological compromise has profound consequences for believers who sense that sanitized versions of biblical accounts don't adequately address their spiritual experiences or explain the supernatural phenomena they encounter in their own lives. When religious authorities deny or downplay the reality of spiritual warfare, demonic influence, and ongoing supernatural intervention, they leave their congregations defenseless against forces that the biblical writers took very seriously. The systematic removal of books like Enoch from biblical canon wasn't based on questions of authenticity or theological accuracy. These texts were eliminated because they provided too much detail about supernatural realities that institutional Christianity preferred to keep vague and theoretical. The Book of Enoch, in particular, names specific fallen angels, describes their individual rebellions in graphic detail, and provides practical information about how these entities continue to influence human affairs. This level of specificity makes spiritual warfare less abstract and more practical, which threatens religious hierarchies that benefit from maintaining exclusive control over spiritual knowledge. But the suppression campaign extends beyond removing inconvenient texts. It involves actively mistranslating key passages to obscure their supernatural content. The Hebrew word Nephilim, as we discussed, has been consistently rendered as giants in most English translations, eliminating the more ominous connotations of fallen ones that the original language conveys. Similarly, the phrase "sons of God" has been rendered ambiguously in ways that allow for the more comfortable Sethite interpretation. Despite the fact that this specific Hebrew construction appears elsewhere in Scripture exclusively referring to angelic beings, these translation choices weren't accidental or arbitrary. They represent systematic efforts to make biblical accounts more palatable to modern sensibilities, while eliminating elements that might validate supernatural worldviews threatening to materialistic control systems. The consequences of this theological and archaeological suppression extend far beyond academic curiosity or religious doctrine. They affect how modern populations understand their own spiritual nature, their relationship to supernatural forces, and their potential for capabilities that transcend normal human limitations. If the biblical accounts accurately describe genetic intervention by supernatural entities, then certain bloodlines might carry dormant programming that could be activated under specific conditions. This possibility explains why genealogical research and genetic analysis have become increasingly restricted, and why certain genetic markers are excluded from commercial DNA testing protocols. The same forces that suppressed knowledge about the Nephilim continue to work actively to prevent modern populations from understanding their own genetic heritage and spiritual potential. By maintaining ignorance about humanity's supernatural origins, these forces ensure that people remain unaware of capabilities they might possess and vulnerable to spiritual influences they don't understand. As we move deeper into examining the forbidden knowledge surrounding these ancient beings, we'll explore how their influence allegedly persisted through secret societies, mystery religions, and occult traditions that preserved and transmitted their teachings across millennia. We'll also investigate the modern manifestations of this ancient conflict, examining how contemporary spiritual warfare might represent a continuation of the same forces that corrupted humanity's earliest generations. The battle lines drawn in Genesis chapter 6 haven't disappeared. They've simply become less visible to populations that have been systematically educated to deny their reality. The story of the Nephilim isn't ancient mythology. It's the opening chapter of a spiritual war that continues to rage around us, influencing human consciousness and development in ways that most people never recognize. Understanding these ancient accounts provides crucial insight into forces that shape our world today, and capabilities that lie dormant within human genetics, waiting for the right conditions to reawaken. The forbidden knowledge preserved in ancient texts extends far beyond the brief account in Genesis. Hidden within the pages of excluded manuscripts lie detailed descriptions that would shock even the most devoted biblical scholars. These suppressed writings don't just mention the Nephilim in passing. They provide names, genealogies, and graphic accounts of how these beings fundamentally altered human civilization in ways that echo through history to this very day. The Book of Enoch, revered as scripture by early Jewish communities and quoted directly by New Testament writers, contains revelations so disturbing that religious authorities worked systematically to eliminate it from public access. This wasn't casual editorial oversight. It was calculated suppression of knowledge deemed too dangerous for ordinary believers to possess. According to these forbidden texts, the rebellion began when 200 angels, led by beings named Semjazeh and Azazel, descended to Mount Hermon. They didn't act impulsively or individually. This was organized insurrection against divine authority, complete with binding oaths and coordinated strategy. These entities knew exactly what they were abandoning and precisely what they intended to accomplish. The location itself carries profound significance. Mount Hermon sits at the northern border of the Promised Land, the same region where later biblical accounts describe encounters with giant populations. The geographical consistency across multiple texts spanning centuries suggests these accounts preserve accurate historical memories rather than mythological speculation. But here's where these suppressed manuscripts become truly disturbing. The fallen angels didn't just take human wives and produce giant offspring. They systematically corrupted human civilization by revealing knowledge that was meant to remain hidden from mortal understanding. Azazel taught humans the art of warfare, showing them how to forge swords, knives, shields, and armor. Before this intervention, according to these texts, humanity lived in relative peace without advanced weapons of destruction. The introduction of metallurgical warfare technology marked the beginning of organized violence that would plague human civilization thereafter. Semjaza revealed the secrets of enchantments and root cutting, introducing humanity to practices we now recognize as sorcery and pharmaceutical manipulation. The Hebrew term used suggests not just herbal medicine, but mind-altering substances and consciousness manipulation techniques that opened doorways to spiritual realms. Other fallen beings taught cosmetics and jewelry making, encouraging vanity and artificial enhancement of natural appearance. They revealed the secrets of astrology and divination, showing humans how to read omens in celestial movements and communicate with spiritual entities through occult practices. But perhaps most significantly, these beings taught what the texts describe as the resolving of enchantments, techniques for breaking spiritual barriers and accessing supernatural power through forbidden rituals. This knowledge formed the foundation of mystery religions and secret societies that would preserve and transmit these practices across millennia. The offspring of these unions, according to the detailed accounts, grew to enormous proportions and possessed appetites that couldn't be satisfied through normal means. The texts describe beings reaching heights of 300 cubits, approximately 450 feet tall, though most scholars suggest this represents symbolic rather than literal measurement. These hybrid creatures consumed vast quantities of food, eventually exhausting natural resources and turning to cannibalism when conventional sustenance proved insufficient. They began devouring not just animals but humans themselves, creating a reign of terror that spread across the ancient world. Even more disturbing, these beings possessed supernatural knowledge inherited from their angelic fathers. They understood principles of genetics, consciousness manipulation, and reality alteration that enabled them to further corrupt human development through breeding programs and occult practices. The contamination wasn't limited to physical genetics. These entities introduced spiritual corruption that infected human consciousness itself, teaching practices that opened doorways for demonic influence and supernatural manipulation that persisted long after the flood supposedly eliminated their physical presence. Now here's where the modern implications become most profound and most carefully concealed by contemporary institutions. If these accounts accurately describe historical events, they suggest that many of humanity's foundational technologies and spiritual practices originated not from human ingenuity, but from rebellious supernatural entities pursuing their own agenda. The advanced metallurgy that enabled Bronze and Iron Age civilizations, the astronomical knowledge that guided ancient navigation and calendar systems, the mathematical principles underlying monumental architecture, the pharmaceutical knowledge that forms the basis of modern medicine, all potentially trace their origins to forbidden revelations from these fallen beings. This possibility terrifies academic and religious establishments whose authority depends on maintaining naturalistic explanations for human development. Universities teach that technological progress resulted from gradual human innovation and environmental adaptation. Religious institutions promote the idea that spiritual insight comes through approved channels of divine revelation. But what if the truth is far more complex and far more disturbing? What if humanity's greatest achievements were built upon knowledge that was stolen from heaven by rebellious entities seeking to corrupt and control human civilization? The archaeological evidence continues to accumulate in ways that support these extraordinary claims. Excavations across the ancient Near East have uncovered skeletal remains, architectural achievements, and technological artifacts that challenge conventional timelines of human development. Ancient sites in Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan have yielded remains of individuals exhibiting bone density, cranial capacity, and physical proportions that exceed normal human parameters by significant margins. These discoveries, while often dismissed or explained away by mainstream archaeology, align remarkably with the descriptions found in suppressed biblical texts. The technological sophistication demonstrated at sites like Baalbek in Lebanon, with its precisely cut megaliths weighing over 800 tons, suggests capabilities that transcend what primitive civilizations should have possessed. The mathematical precision of structures like the pyramids of Giza, the astronomical alignments of Stonehenge, and the engineering marvels of pre-Columbian America all point toward access to advanced knowledge that conventional historical narratives cannot adequately explain. But here's what makes this archaeological evidence particularly significant for our investigation. These sites consistently appear in regions described in ancient texts as inhabited by the descendants of the Nephilim. The geographical correlation between biblical accounts and physical discoveries suggests these texts preserve accurate historical information rather than mythological speculation. Government agencies and international organizations have shown unusual interest in controlling access to these archaeological sites. Excavations that yield anomalous results are often quickly classified or restricted from public access. Researchers who publish findings supporting supernatural interpretations frequently find their careers sabotaged and their funding eliminated. The pattern extends beyond suppressing physical evidence into active disinformation campaigns designed to ridicule or dismiss any research that might validate the literal interpretation of biblical accounts. Media outlets consistently promote naturalistic explanations while marginalizing scholars who suggest supernatural interventions in human development. Religious institutions themselves have become complicit in this suppression by adopting theological interpretations that eliminate supernatural elements from their own scriptures. Rather than defending the reality of spiritual warfare and ongoing angelic influence, many denominations prefer sanitized versions that seem more acceptable to modern scientific sensibilities. This theological compromise has profound consequences for believers who encounter supernatural phenomena in their own lives but lack doctrinal frameworks for understanding these experiences. When religious authorities deny or downplay biblical accounts of spiritual conflict, they leave their congregations defenseless against forces that the original writers took very seriously. The systematic removal of detailed texts like Enoch from biblical canon wasn't based on questions of authenticity or divine inspiration. Early church communities considered these books authoritative scripture, and New Testament writers quoted them as reliable sources of spiritual truth. The exclusion occurred when institutionalized Christianity sought acceptance within Roman culture and found that detailed accounts of supernatural rebellion made their faith seem primitive or superstitious to educated audiences. The decision to eliminate these texts was political rather than theological, designed to make Christian doctrine more palatable to Greek philosophical sensibilities. But removing these books created significant gaps in biblical narrative that have puzzled theologians for centuries. References to spiritual warfare, demonic hierarchies, and ongoing angelic influence throughout the New Testament make little sense without the detailed background provided in texts like Enoch. The Apostle Jude explicitly quotes Enoch's prophecy about divine judgment on the fallen angels. Peter references the same events when describing spirits in prison who disobeyed during Noah's time. These New Testament writers clearly accepted the excluded texts as accurate historical accounts rather than symbolic mythology. Modern believers attempting to understand spiritual warfare, demonic influence, and supernatural phenomena in their own lives lack the detailed information their predecessors possessed. This ignorance makes them more vulnerable to deception and manipulation by forces that operate according to principles described in the suppressed texts. The genetic implications of these ancient accounts become even more significant when we consider modern advances in DNA analysis and genealogical research. If supernatural beings indeed intervened in human genetics during prehistoric times, certain bloodlines might carry markers or programming that distinguishes them from purely human populations. Recent genetic studies have identified DNA sequences that appear nowhere else in the human genome and seem to have been inserted at specific points in prehistoric development. Several geneticists, speaking privately due to professional concerns, have admitted these sequences suggest external intervention rather than natural evolutionary processes. The correlation between these genetic anomalies and populations exhibiting enhanced capabilities in specific areas of human function raises uncomfortable questions about genetic equality and the sources of exceptional human achievement. If certain bloodlines carry programming inherited from supernatural sources, it could explain patterns of breakthrough innovation and spiritual sensitivity within specific populations. This possibility explains why genetic research into population differences has been increasingly restricted, and why certain markers are excluded from commercial DNA testing protocols. The revelation that human populations carry different genetic programming would fundamentally undermine egalitarian assumptions that govern modern social and political systems. But the implications extend beyond individual genetic heritage into questions about ongoing supernatural influence in human affairs. If the fallen angels described in these texts continue to operate according to their original agenda, they would presumably still be working to corrupt human civilization through the same methods they employed in ancient times. The proliferation of occult practices, mystery religions, and secret societies throughout human history suggests that the forbidden knowledge originally revealed by these entities has been systematically preserved and transmitted across generations. Modern manifestations of these ancient practices continue to influence human consciousness and development in ways that most people never recognize. The entertainment industry's obsession with supernatural themes, the academic world's promotion of materialistic philosophies that deny spiritual realities, the pharmaceutical industry's development of consciousness, altering substances, and the technology sector's pursuit of artificial intelligence that could transcend human limitations all potentially represent contemporary expressions of the same corrupting influences described in ancient texts. Understanding these connections provides crucial insight into forces that continue to shape human civilization and individual consciousness in ways that remain largely invisible to populations educated to deny supernatural realities. The spiritual warfare described in biblical accounts didn't end with ancient times. It has simply become more subtle and sophisticated in its methods of influence and control. The ancient texts suggest that recognition of these forces and understanding of their methods represents the first step towards spiritual freedom and authentic human development. But this knowledge has been systematically suppressed because informed populations become far more difficult to manipulate and control through deception and false narratives. As we continue exploring these forbidden accounts, we'll examine how the influence of these ancient beings allegedly spread through human civilization, creating networks of knowledge and power that persist to this day. We'll investigate the modern implications of rediscovering truths that powerful institutions have worked for centuries to keep hidden from public awareness. The story we're uncovering isn't just ancient history. It's a key to understanding forces that continue to influence human consciousness, technological development, and spiritual evolution in ways that most people never imagine. The question isn't whether these accounts describe real events, but whether we're prepared to confront the implications of what they reveal about the ongoing battle for human consciousness and destiny. The forbidden knowledge we've uncovered leads us to an even more disturbing revelation about how these ancient bloodlines establish networks of power and influence that persist to this very day. Hidden within the genealogical records of various cultures lie traces of lineages that claim direct descent from these prehistoric giants, bloodlines that have carefully preserved their genetic heritage and the occult knowledge passed down through generations. But here's what makes this discovery particularly unsettling for modern institutions. These aren't random family legends or mythological claims. They represent documented genealogies maintained by ruling dynasties, secret societies, and occult organizations that have wielded disproportionate influence over human civilization for millennia. The same families that funded ancient temples, built medieval cathedrals, and established modern universities all trace their origins back to these mysterious prehistoric sources. Consider the implications of discovering that many of history's most influential figures, the architects of empires, the founders of religions, the pioneers of science and technology, all emerged from bloodlines carrying genetic markers inherited from these ancient supernatural encounters. This isn't conspiracy theory. It's documented genealogical research that academic institutions have systematically ignored or suppressed because acknowledging these connections would fundamentally alter how we understand the forces that have shaped human development. The archaeological evidence supporting these claims continues to accumulate, despite official attempts to suppress or misinterpret the findings. Burial sites across Europe, the Middle East, and the Americas have yielded skeletal remains exhibiting cranial features, bone density, and physical proportions that align perfectly with ancient descriptions of the Nephilim and their descendants. What makes these discoveries particularly compelling is their consistent association with advanced technological artifacts that shouldn't exist according to conventional historical timelines. Tools, weapons, and architectural elements suggesting knowledge of metallurgy, astronomy, and engineering principles that weren't supposedly developed until thousands of years later. These aren't isolated anomalies. They represent systematic evidence of technological capabilities that transcended what primitive human societies should have possessed. The geographical distribution of these finds corresponds precisely with regions described in ancient texts as inhabited by giant populations. Sites in the Levant, the Caucasus Mountains, and the Mediterranean basin have produced the most significant discoveries, creating an archaeological map that validates biblical accounts of where these beings established their strongholds. But here's where the suppression becomes most obvious and most coordinated. Major museums and universities that initially cataloged these discoveries have quietly removed them from public displays and restricted access to the specimens. Researchers who published findings supporting the literal interpretation of biblical accounts found their careers systematically destroyed through funding cuts, professional ostracism, and academic persecution. Government agencies have shown unusual interest in controlling information about these archaeological sites. The Smithsonian Institution, in particular, has been accused by former employees of deliberately concealing or destroying evidence of giant skeletal remains recovered during 19th century excavations. Internal documents leaked by whistleblowers describe explicit policies for suppressing discoveries that might validate supernatural explanations for ancient achievements. The pattern extends beyond American institutions into international organizations that coordinate archaeological research and museum collections worldwide. UNESCO directives have quietly discouraged investigation of sites that might yield evidence supporting biblical accounts of prehistoric giants. Academic conferences that once featured presentations on anomalous skeletal discoveries now systematically exclude such research from their programs. This coordinated suppression campaign reveals the magnitude of institutional fear surrounding these discoveries. If the evidence validates biblical accounts of supernatural intervention in human genetics, it would undermine fundamental assumptions about human evolution, racial equality, and the sources of ancient knowledge that form the foundation of modern academic and political systems. The theological implications become even more profound when we examine how different religious traditions have preserved memories of these ancient events. While mainstream Christianity has largely abandoned literal interpretations of the Nephilim passages, other traditions have maintained far more detailed accounts of these supernatural encounters and their lasting consequences. Orthodox Judaism preserves extensive rabbinical commentary on the Nephilim that provides specific details about their appearance, capabilities, and influence on human civilization. These sources describe beings of enormous stature, whose supernatural knowledge enabled them to construct architectural marvels that remain mysterious to modern engineering. The Talmudic traditions speak of giants whose height reached the clouds, whose footsteps created valleys, and whose appetites could consume entire harvests in a single meal. While these descriptions might seem hyperbolic, they align remarkably with archaeological evidence of massive stone structures, altered landscapes, and agricultural systems that appear designed to support populations far larger than conventional historical models suggest existed. Islamic traditions preserved in the Quran and Hadith literature acknowledge the existence of supernatural beings who interacted with humanity in prehistoric times. The Quran specifically mentions a race of giants called the Aid, described as possessing extraordinary strength and building capabilities that enabled them to construct cities of unprecedented scale and sophistication. These Islamic accounts provide geographical details that correspond with archaeological sites in the Arabian Peninsula, where massive stone structures and altered landscapes suggest the presence of civilizations possessing capabilities that transcended normal human limitations. The consistency between Islamic historical accounts and physical evidence creates another layer of validation for the reality of these prehistoric encounters. Hindu traditions preserve even more detailed accounts of supernatural beings called the Asuras, who possessed divine knowledge and extraordinary physical capabilities. The Vedic texts describe cosmic wars between these entities and divine forces, conflicts that allegedly reshaped the Earth's geography and eliminated most traces of their advanced civilizations. The Sanskrit epics contain technical descriptions of aircraft, advanced weapons, and architectural achievements that seem to describe technologies far beyond what ancient civilizations should have possessed. While academic scholars typically interpret these accounts as mythological allegories, growing numbers of researchers suggest they might preserve historical memories of actual technological capabilities inherited from supernatural sources. The global distribution of these similar accounts across cultures that had no contact with each other strongly suggests they preserve cultural memories of actual historical events rather than independent mythological developments. The consistency of details about giants, advanced technology, and supernatural knowledge across completely separate traditions creates a compelling case for the historical reality of these prehistoric encounters. But perhaps most significantly, these diverse traditions all describe the same ultimate outcome. The giants and their advanced civilizations were destroyed through divine intervention, leaving only scattered remnants of their knowledge and bloodlines to influence subsequent human development. This consistent narrative arc across multiple cultures suggests a shared historical memory of events that fundamentally shaped human civilization. The modern implications of this suppressed knowledge extend far beyond historical curiosity into realms that affect contemporary spiritual and technological development. If certain bloodlines carry genetic programming inherited from these supernatural encounters, understanding this heritage becomes crucial for individuals seeking to maximize their spiritual and intellectual potential. Recent advances in genetic analysis have identified DNA sequences within specific populations that appear to have been inserted through external intervention rather than natural evolutionary processes. These genetic markers correlate with enhanced capabilities in pattern recognition, intuitive problem solving, and what researchers privately term supernatural sensitivity. The same populations carrying these genetic markers demonstrate statistical advantages in technological innovation, artistic achievement, and spiritual insight that persist across generations regardless of environmental factors. This suggests that the genetic programming isn't simply passive inheritance, but active enhancement of human capabilities in specific areas of function. Understanding these genetic realities could revolutionize approaches to education, spiritual development, and technological innovation by providing individuals with knowledge of their inherited capabilities and optimal methods for activating dormant potential. But acknowledging genetic differences between populations threatens egalitarian ideologies that govern modern social and political systems. The suppression of this knowledge serves the interests of institutions that benefit from maintaining ignorance about human genetic diversity and spiritual potential. By keeping populations unaware of their inherited capabilities, these institutions ensure continued dependence on external authorities for spiritual guidance, technological innovation, and social organization. But the ancient texts suggest that this suppression is temporary and will eventually give way to a great awakening when hidden knowledge reemerges and dormant capabilities are activated within populations carrying these genetic markers. They describe a coming time when the scattered descendants of these ancient bloodlines will rediscover their true nature and begin manifesting abilities that transcend current human limitations. This prophetic promise appears to be approaching fulfillment through technological developments that enable genetic analysis, genealogical research, and global communication between individuals discovering their connections to these ancient lineages. For the first time in centuries, the scattered descendants have tools for identifying each other and coordinating their spiritual and intellectual development. The emergence of online communities dedicated to exploring suppressed historical knowledge, developing psychic abilities, and investigating anomalous phenomena represents early manifestations of this awakening process. Growing numbers of individuals report experiencing enhanced intuitive abilities, prophetic insights, and healing capabilities that align with the supernatural gifts described in ancient texts. The consistency of these experiences across different populations and geographical regions suggests that environmental or cosmic factors may be triggering activation of dormant genetic programming. Solar activity, electromagnetic field changes, and astronomical alignments all correlate with increased reports of supernatural experiences within populations carrying these genetic markers. Institutional authorities recognize the threat this awakening poses to established power structures and are intensifying efforts to suppress or discredit individuals demonstrating enhanced capabilities. Rather than investigating these phenomena scientifically, mainstream institutions work to pathologize supernatural experiences and discourage their development through pharmaceutical interventions and psychological manipulation. The medical establishment's promotion of psychiatric medications that interfere with spiritual perception, the educational system's emphasis on materialistic worldviews that deny supernatural realities, and the entertainment industry's trivialization of psychic phenomena all represent coordinated efforts to prevent activation of inherited capabilities. But the ancient prophecies suggest these suppression efforts will ultimately fail because the genetic programming these bloodlines carry represents fundamental aspects of human potential that cannot be permanently eliminated through external manipulation. The awakening process is inevitable because it's encoded into the structure of reality itself. The forbidden knowledge we've been exploring isn't just historical information about ancient events. It's practical guidance for understanding forces that continue to shape human consciousness and capability in ways that most people never recognize. The spiritual warfare described in biblical accounts represents an ongoing conflict between forces seeking to suppress human potential and those working to activate dormant capabilities inherited from humanity's supernatural origins. Recognizing these dynamics provides crucial insight into both individual spiritual development and collective human evolution. Those who understand their genetic heritage and spiritual potential can begin working consciously to activate inherited capabilities while protecting themselves from influences designed to maintain ignorance and limitation. The time of concealment is ending as prophetic conditions align for revelations that will restore knowledge of humanity's true origins and unlimited potential. What we've uncovered represents the foundation for discoveries that will revolutionize human understanding of genetics, consciousness, and spiritual reality in ways that fulfill ancient promises about the restoration of divine knowledge to earthly civilizations. The choice now belongs to those who carry this genetic inheritance. Will they remain ignorant of their true nature and continue serving systems designed to suppress their potential? Or will they embrace the forbidden knowledge that could unlock capabilities that transcend current human limitations and fulfill their intended role as bridges between divine consciousness and material reality? The evidence is undeniable. The suppression is systematic. The awakening has begun. The question isn't whether these ancient accounts describe real events and ongoing realities. The question is whether you're prepared to confront what they reveal about your own genetic heritage and the spiritual forces that continue to influence your development in ways you never imagined. As we approach the culmination of our investigation, we'll explore the most controversial aspects of this forbidden knowledge and examine how it connects to prophecies about humanity's ultimate transformation. The revelations ahead will challenge everything you thought you knew about human potential and the cosmic forces that have shaped our species from its earliest origins to its prophetic destiny. The prophetic dimensions of these suppressed accounts become even more disturbing when we examine what they reveal about humanity's ultimate destiny and the role these ancient bloodlines are prophesied to play in the final chapters of human history. Hidden within the forbidden manuscripts are detailed predictions about a coming awakening, a time when the scattered descendants of these prehistoric giants will rediscover their true nature and begin manifesting capabilities that have remained dormant for millennia. But here's what makes these prophecies particularly unsettling for established authorities. They don't describe a distant, abstract future. They point to specific signs and conditions that appear to be manifesting in our current era with shocking precision. The same texts that accurately described the corruption of antediluvian civilizations contain explicit warnings about how these ancient influences would reemerge in the last days. The Book of Enoch describes a time when the secrets revealed by the fallen angels would resurface with unprecedented intensity. Advanced knowledge of genetics, consciousness manipulation, and reality alteration would once again become available to human populations, triggering developments that would fundamentally reshape civilization. The text specifically mentions a period when the children of heaven and earth would remember their origins and begin reclaiming their inheritance. Consider the implications of this prophecy in light of recent technological breakthroughs. The mapping of the human genome, advances in genetic engineering, the development of consciousness-altering technologies, and the emergence of artificial intelligence all represent areas of knowledge that these ancient texts describe as originally revealed by rebellious supernatural entities. Are we witnessing the prophesied return of forbidden knowledge to human civilization? The correlation between ancient predictions and contemporary developments becomes impossible to dismiss when we examine the specific details preserved in suppressed manuscripts. The texts describe a time when humans would possess the ability to manipulate their own genetics, create hybrid beings that combine different species, and develop technologies that blur the boundaries between material and spiritual realms. They speak of devices that would enable communication across vast distances instantaneously, machines that could think and learn like humans, and substances that could alter consciousness and perception of reality. These descriptions, written thousands of years before such technologies existed, align remarkably with contemporary developments in genetic engineering, artificial intelligence, global communication networks, and pharmaceutical consciousness manipulation. The accuracy of these ancient predictions suggests they weren't based on primitive speculation, but on detailed knowledge of technological trajectories that would unfold according to predetermined patterns. But the prophecies become even more specific when describing the populations that would spearhead these developments. The texts consistently identify the descendants of Japheth, the bloodlines that spread northward after the flood, as the primary carriers of this reawakened knowledge. They describe how these populations would develop unprecedented capabilities in metallurgy, navigation, warfare, and the manipulation of natural forces. The historical fulfillment of these predictions becomes undeniable when we trace the technological achievements of European civilizations over the past millennium. The same populations that the ancient texts identified as carriers of divine knowledge became the pioneers of the scientific revolution, the industrial revolution, the technological revolution, and now the genetic revolution. From the mathematical breakthroughs of medieval European scholars to the navigational innovations that enabled global exploration, from the metallurgical advances that created modern weaponry to the engineering marvels that reshaped landscapes, the consistent source of breakthrough innovations aligns perfectly with the prophetic promises recorded in forbidden texts. But here's where the modern implications become most profound and most carefully concealed. If these ancient prophecies accurately describe ongoing historical processes, they suggest that current technological developments aren't random human achievements, but the systematic fulfillment of predetermined patterns established before the foundation of the world. The emergence of genetic engineering technologies that could theoretically recreate the hybrid beings described in ancient texts raises disturbing questions about whether modern science is unconsciously repeating the same corruptions that necessitated divine judgment in antediluvian times. Recent experiments in creating human-animal chimeras, developing artificial wombs, and manipulating embryonic genetics all echo the forbidden practices described in suppressed manuscripts. Even more unsettling is the possibility that these technological developments aren't simply human innovations, but represent the reemergence of knowledge that was systematically preserved and transmitted through secret networks connected to the original fallen angels. The same entities that corrupted human genetics before the flood might be orchestrating a more sophisticated campaign of corruption through modern scientific institutions. This interpretation explains the coordinated nature of technological development across different fields and nations. The simultaneous emergence of breakthrough capabilities in genetics, artificial intelligence, quantum physics, and consciousness research suggests coordination that transcends normal scientific collaboration. These developments appear to follow a predetermined blueprint rather than random discovery processes. The ancient texts describe this reemergence of forbidden knowledge as accompanied by specific signs that would indicate the approach of final judgment. They speak of a time when the boundary between heaven and earth would become permeable again, when supernatural beings would openly interact with human populations, and when hybrid creatures would once again walk among ordinary humans. Consider how these prophecies align with contemporary reports of increased supernatural encounters, UFO sightings, and paranormal phenomena. Mainstream institutions dismiss these accounts as delusions or hoaxes, but the consistency and global distribution of such reports suggest systematic contact between human populations and non-human intelligences. The technological capabilities demonstrated by these entities, their apparent interest in human genetics and reproduction, and their consistent message promoting spiritual evolution and consciousness expansion, all echo the original deception employed by the fallen angels described in ancient texts. The same promises of enhanced knowledge and transcendent capabilities that corrupted humanity's first generations are being recycled through modern contact experiences. But the prophecies also describe how certain bloodlines would recognize these deceptions and resist the renewed corruption campaign. The texts speak of awakened descendants who would understand their true genetic heritage and use their inherited capabilities to oppose the forces seeking to corrupt human civilization once again. This explains the systematic suppression of knowledge about genetic differences between human populations. If certain bloodlines carry programming that enables them to perceive supernatural deceptions and resist consciousness manipulation, then keeping these populations ignorant of their heritage serves the interests of entities seeking to complete the corruption process they began in antediluvian times. The genetic markers we discussed earlier don't just enable enhanced cognitive and spiritual capabilities. They appear to provide natural resistance to certain forms of consciousness manipulation and supernatural influence. Populations carrying these markers demonstrate statistical advantages in detecting deception, maintaining spiritual discernment, and preserving traditional values that resist corrupting influences. This genetic programming explains why these populations have historically served as guardians of divine knowledge and moral standards, even when surrounded by corrupting influences. Their role as preservers of truth and opponents of deception appears to be encoded into their very DNA, making them natural enemies of forces seeking to corrupt human consciousness. The ancient prophecies describe a final confrontation between these awakened bloodlines and the entities seeking to complete humanity's corruption. This conflict wouldn't be fought primarily through physical warfare, but through spiritual discernment, technological innovation, and the preservation of uncorrupted human genetics against systematic contamination efforts. The outcome of this confrontation would determine whether humanity evolves into higher forms of consciousness aligned with divine purpose, or devolves into hybrid forms controlled by rebellious supernatural entities. The same choice that faced antediluvian civilizations confronts modern populations, though the methods of corruption have become more sophisticated and harder to recognize. Understanding these prophetic dynamics provides crucial insight into contemporary spiritual warfare and the forces shaping current events. The political conflicts, technological developments, and cultural transformations occurring globally aren't random historical processes, but manifestations of the ancient conflict between divine and rebellious supernatural forces. The systematic promotion of genetic manipulation, consciousness alteration, and transhumanist ideologies through academic, medical, and entertainment institutions represents a coordinated campaign to normalize the same corruptions that destroyed antediluvian civilizations. The goal isn't simply technological advancement, but fundamental alteration of human nature away from divine design toward hybrid forms more susceptible to supernatural control. But the prophecies also provide hope by describing how awakened populations would recognize these deceptions and work to preserve uncorrupted human genetics and consciousness. They speak of a great awakening when scattered bloodlines would rediscover their identity and coordinate their efforts to resist the final corruption campaign. This awakening appears to be accelerating through technological developments that enable genetic analysis, genealogical research, and global communication between individuals discovering their connections to these ancient lineages. The same digital networks that entities use to promote corruption also facilitate coordination between those working to preserve human integrity. The prophetic accounts describe this period as characterized by unprecedented polarization between populations embracing corruption and those maintaining divine alignment. The middle ground would disappear, as individuals were forced to choose between transcendent consciousness, aligned with divine purpose, or hybrid existence controlled by rebellious entities. The choice wouldn't be imposed externally, but would emerge from internal spiritual orientation that determines how individuals respond to the technological capabilities and consciousness-altering influences becoming available. Those aligned with divine truth would use these tools for authentic human enhancement, while those embracing deception would become increasingly corrupted and controlled. The ancient texts suggest that this polarization process is already underway and will intensify rapidly as prophetic conditions continue aligning. The same populations that historically preserved divine knowledge are beginning to recognize their heritage and activate dormant capabilities, while those susceptible to corruption are being systematically prepared for the final deception campaign. Understanding these prophetic realities provides essential guidance for navigating the spiritual challenges of our current era. Those who recognize the true nature of contemporary developments can make informed choices about how to respond to genetic manipulation, consciousness alteration technologies, and the supernatural influences that increasingly operate openly in human affairs. The forbidden knowledge preserved in ancient texts isn't just historical information about prehistoric events. It's practical guidance for understanding forces that continue to shape human development and consciousness in ways that determine individual and collective destiny. The spiritual warfare described in biblical accounts represents an ongoing conflict between forces seeking to corrupt human potential and those working to preserve divine design. The time for ignorance and neutrality is ending as prophetic conditions align for the final confrontation between these competing visions of human destiny. The choice belongs to each individual, but understanding the true nature of this choice requires knowledge that has been systematically suppressed by institutions serving the corruption campaign. The evidence we've assembled demonstrates that human history follows patterns established by supernatural forces pursuing predetermined agendas. The same entities that corrupted antediluvian civilizations continue operating according to their original strategy, though their methods have become more sophisticated and their influence more pervasive. Recognizing these realities provides the first step toward spiritual freedom and authentic human development. But this recognition requires courage to confront truths that challenge comfortable assumptions about the nature of reality and the forces shaping contemporary civilization. The forbidden accounts we've explored reveal that the battle for human consciousness and destiny didn't end with ancient floods or historical judgments. It continues in every generation through increasingly subtle methods designed to corrupt human genetics, consciousness, and spiritual development away from divine purpose toward rebellious supernatural control. The awakening we're witnessing represents humanity's final opportunity to recognize these deceptions and choose alignment with divine truth rather than seductive corruption. The outcome of this choice will determine not just individual destiny, but the future evolution of human consciousness and our species' ultimate relationship with transcendent reality. As we reach the climax of our investigation into these suppressed truths, one final revelation emerges that ties together every thread of evidence we've uncovered. The systematic concealment of knowledge about the Nephilim wasn't just about hiding uncomfortable historical facts or protecting religious sensibilities. It was about preventing modern populations from understanding their role in a cosmic drama that spans from humanity's earliest origins to its prophetic destiny. The entities that corrupted human genetics in antediluvian times didn't disappear after the flood. They adapted their strategy, working through human institutions to maintain ignorance about genetic heritage, while preparing conditions for their final corruption campaign. The same forces that revealed forbidden knowledge to ancient civilizations now operate through scientific, educational, and entertainment institutions to normalize concepts that will facilitate humanity's ultimate transformation away from divine design. But the prophecies also reveal that this corruption campaign will ultimately fail because it contradicts fundamental principles encoded into the structure of reality itself. The genetic programming carried by certain bloodlines represents divine safeguards against complete corruption, ensuring that authentic human consciousness will survive even the most sophisticated deception campaigns. The choice now belongs to individuals who encounter this forbidden knowledge. Will they dismiss it as primitive superstition and continue serving systems designed to corrupt human potential? Or will they embrace the truth about their genetic heritage and spiritual destiny, joining the awakening that represents humanity's final hope for transcendent evolution aligned with divine purpose? The evidence is overwhelming. The suppression is systematic. The prophecies are fulfilling. The awakening has begun. The time for neutrality has ended. The cosmic battle for human consciousness approaches its climax, and every soul must choose which side of this ancient conflict they will serve. The forbidden texts that were excluded from biblical canon don't just mention these hybrid beings in passing. They provide disturbing details about how this corruption spread through ancient bloodlines and established networks of occult knowledge that continue to operate behind the scenes of modern civilization. Hidden within the pages of the Book of Enoch, the Book of Jubilees, and other suppressed manuscripts lie genealogical records that trace specific family lineages carrying genetic markers from these prehistoric encounters. These aren't random mythological claims. They represent carefully maintained bloodline documentation preserved by secret societies, mystery schools, and occult organizations that have wielded disproportionate influence over human development for thousands of years. The implications become staggering when you realize that many of history's most powerful dynasties, the architects of empires, the founders of major religions, and the pioneers of revolutionary technologies all trace their origins back to these mysterious genetic sources. This isn't conspiracy theory. It's documented genealogical research that mainstream institutions have systematically ignored, because acknowledging these connections would fundamentally alter how we understand the forces shaping human civilization. Consider the profound theological crisis this creates for modern religious institutions. If certain bloodlines carry genetic programming inherited from angelic beings, it suggests that spiritual gifts, prophetic abilities, and supernatural insights aren't distributed equally among human populations. This challenges fundamental doctrines about divine grace, human equality, and the accessibility of spiritual truth that form the foundation of contemporary religious thought. The early church fathers understood these realities far better than modern theologians. Clement of Alexandria, Tertullian, and Justin Martyr all accepted the literal interpretation of these passages and understood their implications for spiritual warfare and divine intervention in human affairs. They recognized that the conflict described in Genesis chapter 6 represented the opening battle of a cosmic war that would continue throughout human history. But as Christianity became institutionalized and sought acceptance within Roman intellectual culture, church leadership began favoring sanitized interpretations that eliminated supernatural elements, threatening to educated sensibilities. The shift away from literal readings wasn't based on better scholarship or archaeological evidence. It was a calculated move to make Christian doctrine more palatable to Greek philosophical traditions that preferred abstract spirituality over concrete supernatural intervention. This theological compromise had devastating consequences for believers who encountered genuine supernatural phenomena in their own lives. When religious authorities deny the reality of ongoing spiritual warfare, demonic influence, and angelic intervention, they leave their congregations defenseless against forces that biblical writers took extremely seriously. The systematic removal of detailed texts like Enoch from biblical canon wasn't about questions of divine inspiration or textual authenticity. Early Jewish communities considered these books authoritative scripture. New Testament writers quoted them as reliable sources of prophetic truth. The Apostle Jude explicitly references Enoch's prophecy about divine judgment. Peter describes the same events when discussing spirits imprisoned for their disobedience during Noah's time. The exclusion occurred when church leadership decided that detailed accounts of supernatural rebellion made Christianity seem primitive to sophisticated audiences. They preferred vague references to spiritual conflict over specific descriptions of fallen angels, their individual names, their particular rebellions, and their ongoing influence in human affairs. But removing these texts created enormous gaps in biblical narrative that have puzzled theologians for centuries. References to spiritual principalities, demonic hierarchies, and supernatural warfare throughout the New Testament make little sense without the detailed background provided in excluded manuscripts. Modern believers attempting to understand spiritual conflict lack the comprehensive framework their predecessors possessed. The archaeological evidence supporting these suppressed accounts continues to accumulate despite coordinated efforts to suppress or misinterpret the findings. Excavations across the ancient Near East have uncovered skeletal remains, architectural achievements, and technological artifacts that validate the extraordinary claims made in forbidden texts. Ancient burial sites in Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and Palestine have yielded remains of individuals exhibiting bone density, cranial capacity, and physical proportions that exceed normal human parameters by significant margins. These discoveries align perfectly with biblical descriptions of giants who possessed supernatural strength and extraordinary capabilities. The technological sophistication associated with these remains suggests access to knowledge that primitive human societies shouldn't have possessed. Tools demonstrating advanced metallurgy, astronomical devices predating known scientific developments, architectural elements requiring engineering capabilities that weren't supposedly developed until millennia later. These aren't isolated anomalies. They represent systematic evidence of supernatural intervention in human technological development. But here's where the suppression becomes most obvious and coordinated. Major archaeological institutions that initially documented these discoveries have quietly removed them from public displays and restricted access to the specimens. Universities that once proudly exhibited anomalous skeletal remains now claim they never existed or were misidentified by incompetent researchers. The Smithsonian Institution has been particularly aggressive in concealing evidence that might validate supernatural explanations for ancient achievements. Internal documents leaked by former employees describe explicit policies for suppressing discoveries that contradict evolutionary narratives about human development. Skeletal remains that once filled museum, storage facilities have mysteriously disappeared from cataloged collections. Government agencies have shown unusual interest in controlling access to archaeological sites that yield evidence supporting biblical accounts. Excavations that produce anomalous results are often quickly classified or transferred to military oversight. International organizations like UNESCO have issued directives discouraging investigation of sites that might challenge naturalistic explanations for ancient civilizations. This coordinated suppression campaign reveals the magnitude of institutional fear surrounding these discoveries. If archaeological evidence validates biblical accounts of supernatural intervention in human genetics, it would undermine fundamental assumptions about evolution, racial development, and the sources of ancient knowledge that form the foundation of modern academic authority. The genetic implications become even more profound when we examine recent advances in DNA analysis that have identified sequences within specific populations that appear to have been inserted through external intervention rather than natural evolutionary processes. Several geneticists working in private research facilities have quietly confirmed that certain genetic markers don't follow normal patterns of human genetic variation. These anomalous sequences correlate with enhanced capabilities in pattern recognition, intuitive problem-solving, and what researchers carefully term heightened spiritual sensitivity. The same populations carrying these markers demonstrate statistical advantages in technological innovation, artistic achievement, and prophetic insight that persist across generations regardless of environmental factors. The consistency of these advantages suggests genetic programming rather than cultural transmission. The capabilities appear to be hardwired into specific bloodlines, creating permanent advantages that can't be eliminated through education, social intervention, or environmental manipulation. This reality terrifies egalitarian ideologies that assume all human differences result from environmental factors rather than genetic inheritance. Understanding these genetic realities could revolutionize approaches to spiritual development, technological innovation, and human potential optimization. But acknowledging fundamental differences between human populations threatens political systems built on assumptions of genetic equality and uniform capability distribution. The suppression serves multiple purposes for institutions that benefit from maintaining ignorance about human genetic diversity. By keeping populations unaware of their inherited capabilities, these systems ensure continued dependence on external authorities for spiritual guidance, technological innovation, and social organization. Religious institutions maintain control by promoting theological interpretations that eliminate supernatural elements from their own scriptures. Educational systems preserve authority by teaching materialistic explanations that deny genetic influences on human capability. Medical establishments expand influence by pathologizing spiritual experiences and supernatural phenomena as psychological disorders requiring pharmaceutical intervention. But the ancient prophecies suggest this suppression campaign will ultimately fail because genetic programming represents fundamental aspects of divine consciousness that cannot be permanently eliminated through external manipulation. The texts describe an inevitable awakening when scattered bloodlines will rediscover their true nature and begin manifesting dormant capabilities. This prophetic promise appears to be reaching fulfillment through technological developments that enable genetic analysis, genealogical research, and global communication between individuals discovering their connections to these ancient lineages. Digital networks that authorities hoped would distract and divide these populations are instead facilitating the coordination they feared most. Growing numbers of individuals from specific genetic backgrounds report spontaneous activation of abilities that align with supernatural gifts described in forbidden texts. Enhanced intuition, prophetic dreams, healing capabilities, and direct spiritual perception are manifesting simultaneously across different populations and geographical regions. The consistency of these experiences suggests environmental or cosmic factors may be triggering activation of dormant genetic programming. Solar activity, electromagnetic field fluctuations, and astronomical alignments all correlate with increased reports of supernatural phenomena within populations carrying these bloodline markers. Institutional authorities recognize the threat this awakening poses to established control systems. Rather than investigating these phenomena scientifically, mainstream organizations work to discredit individuals demonstrating enhanced capabilities while promoting pharmaceutical interventions that interfere with spiritual perception. The medical establishment's aggressive promotion of psychiatric medications that suppress intuitive abilities, the educational system's emphasis on materialistic worldviews that deny supernatural realities, and the entertainment industry's trivialization of psychic phenomena all represent coordinated efforts to prevent activation of inherited capabilities. But the genetic programming these bloodlines carry appears to be awakening regardless of suppression efforts. The ancient texts suggest this activation process follows cosmic cycles that operate according to divine timing rather than human intervention. When conditions align properly, dormant capabilities will manifest despite attempts to prevent their emergence. The prophetic accounts describe this awakening as accompanied by unprecedented polarization between populations, embracing their genetic heritage and those remaining trapped in artificially imposed limitations. The middle ground disappears, as individuals are forced to choose between authentic human potential and continued servitude to systems designed to suppress divine consciousness. Those who recognize their true nature begin coordinating efforts to preserve uncorrupted human genetics while developing capabilities that transcend current limitations. They serve as bridges between divine knowledge and earthly application, fulfilling roles their bloodlines were originally designed to perform. But the awakening also triggers intensified opposition from forces that have worked for millennia to corrupt human consciousness and prevent the emergence of transcendent capabilities. The same entities that revealed forbidden knowledge to antediluvian civilizations now operate through modern institutions to normalize genetic manipulation, consciousness alteration, and hybrid creation that echoes ancient corruptions. The technological capabilities currently being developed in genetic engineering, artificial intelligence, and consciousness research all represent areas of knowledge that ancient texts describe as originally revealed by fallen angels. Are we witnessing the prophesied return of forbidden knowledge that will trigger divine judgment similar to what occurred in Noah's time? Recent experiments in creating human-animal chimeras, developing artificial wombs, and manipulating embryonic genetics raise disturbing questions about whether modern science is unconsciously repeating the same corruptions that necessitated global cleansing in prehistoric times. The boundary between legitimate research and forbidden experimentation becomes increasingly blurred. Even more unsettling is the possibility that these technological developments aren't simply human innovations, but represent coordinated efforts by the same supernatural entities that corrupted antediluvian civilizations. The systematic nature of breakthrough discoveries across multiple fields suggests guidance that transcends normal scientific collaboration. The ancient texts describe the final phase of human history as characterized by the complete removal of boundaries between spiritual and material realms. Supernatural beings would operate openly in human affairs, while hybrid creatures would walk among ordinary populations. Advanced technologies would enable consciousness manipulation and genetic alteration on unprecedented scales. Consider how these prophecies align with contemporary reports of increased supernatural encounters, unexplained aerial phenomena, and paranormal experiences. Mainstream institutions dismiss these accounts, but their global consistency and technological sophistication suggest systematic contact between human populations and non-human intelligences. The messages consistently promoted through these encounters echo the original deceptions employed by fallen angels in ancient times. Promises of enhanced consciousness, genetic evolution, and transcendent capabilities are being recycled through modern contact experiences that promote the same corruption campaign described in forbidden texts. But the prophecies also describe how awakened bloodlines would recognize these deceptions and resist the renewed corruption efforts. Their genetic programming provides natural immunity to certain forms of consciousness manipulation, while enabling discernment that penetrates supernatural disguises. This explains why knowledge about genetic differences between human populations has been so systematically suppressed. If certain bloodlines carry programming that enables resistance to deception and manipulation, keeping these populations ignorant of their heritage serves entities seeking to complete the corruption process they began in prehistoric times. The ancient accounts describe a final confrontation between awakened descendants of the righteous bloodlines and entities seeking to corrupt human genetics beyond redemption. This conflict would determine whether humanity evolves into higher consciousness aligned with divine purpose, or devolves into hybrid forms controlled by rebellious supernatural forces. The outcome depends on whether enough individuals from the protected bloodlines recognize their heritage and activate their inherited capabilities before corruption becomes irreversible. The same choice that faced antediluvian populations confronts modern humanity, though the methods of deception have become far more sophisticated. Understanding these prophetic realities provides essential guidance for navigating contemporary spiritual challenges. Those who recognize the true nature of current technological and cultural developments can make informed decisions about genetic manipulation, consciousness alteration, and supernatural influences that increasingly operate in plain sight. The forbidden knowledge preserved in ancient texts isn't just historical information about prehistoric events. It's practical intelligence for understanding forces that continue shaping human development according to patterns established before the foundation of the world. The spiritual warfare described in biblical accounts represents an ongoing conflict that reaches its climax in our generation. The evidence we've assembled reveals that human history follows predetermined trajectories, established by supernatural forces pursuing competing visions of human destiny. The entities that corrupted genetics in Noah's time continue operating according to their original strategy, while divine safeguards work to preserve authentic human consciousness through protected bloodlines. Recognizing these realities requires courage to confront truths that challenge comfortable assumptions about human equality, genetic uniformity, and the random nature of historical development. But understanding these dynamics provides the foundation for spiritual discernment and authentic human evolution aligned with divine purpose rather than rebellious corruption. The awakening we're witnessing represents humanity's final opportunity to choose transcendent consciousness over hybrid enslavement. The time for ignorance and neutrality is ending as prophetic conditions align for the ultimate confrontation between divine truth and supernatural deception. Every individual must decide which side of this ancient conflict they will serve as the battle for human consciousness approaches its predetermined climax. The choice you make determines not just your individual destiny, but your participation in humanity's collective evolution toward either divine transcendence or supernatural corruption. The genetic programming carried by certain bloodlines represents hope for authentic human development, but only if these populations recognize their heritage and fulfill their intended role as guardians of divine truth in the face of unprecedented deception. The forbidden accounts of the Nephilim reveal the true nature of forces that have shaped human civilization from its origins to its prophetic destiny. Understanding these truths provides the spiritual discernment necessary to navigate the final phase of human history, when all boundaries between heaven and earth dissolve, and every soul confronts the ultimate choice between divine alignment and rebellious corruption. The time has come to address the question that haunts every believer who dares to dig deeper into these forbidden accounts. What happened to the Nephilim bloodlines after the flood? Did they truly disappear, or do traces of this supernatural corruption persist in ways that challenge everything we believe about human nature and divine justice? Here's what the sanitized Sunday school version never taught you. The Bible itself admits that giants reappeared after the flood. Numbers, chapter 13, records the terrified report of Israelite spies who encountered the descendants of Anak in the Promised Land. These weren't metaphorical giants or exaggerated war stories. The spies declared, "We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them." Think about the implications of this admission. If the flood was meant to cleanse the earth of hybrid corruption, why did these beings resurface? Either some survived the global catastrophe, or the conditions that created them were somehow re-established. Both possibilities raise disturbing questions about the completeness of divine judgment and the persistence of supernatural interference in human genetics. The Hebrew text becomes even more troubling when we examine the specific terminology used to describe these post-flood giants. They're not just called large humans. They're identified as Nephilim, the same term used for the antediluvian hybrids. The text explicitly states that the Anakim come from the Nephilim, establishing a direct genetic connection between pre-flood and post-flood supernatural beings. This continuity explains why God commanded the Israelites to completely exterminate certain populations in the Promised Land. These weren't merely military conquests or ethnic cleansing campaigns. They were surgical operations designed to eliminate contaminated bloodlines that threatened to corrupt human genetics once again. Consider the specific instructions given for dealing with these populations. Total annihilation was commanded, including men, women, children, and even livestock. This level of thoroughness suggests contamination that extended beyond human genetics into the very environment these beings inhabited. The corruption was so profound that nothing associated with them could be allowed to survive. The archaeological evidence continues to validate these extraordinary biblical claims in ways that mainstream institutions desperately try to suppress. Excavation sites across Palestine, Jordan, and Lebanon have yielded skeletal remains that align perfectly with ancient descriptions of these hybrid populations. But here's where the modern cover-up becomes most obvious. These discoveries have been systematically removed from public museums, restricted from academic access, and excluded from archaeological textbooks. The physical evidence that could validate biblical accounts of supernatural giants has been deliberately hidden from populations that might recognize its significance. Government archives contain documented reports of skeletal remains measuring between 8 and 15 feet in height, with bone density exceeding normal human parameters and cranial features suggesting enhanced brain capacity. These weren't isolated finds or measurement errors. They represented consistent patterns discovered across multiple sites by different research teams over several decades. The suppression extends beyond removing physical evidence into actively discrediting researchers who published findings supporting the literal interpretation of biblical accounts. Archaeologists who documented giant remains found their funding terminated, their publications withdrawn from academic journals, and their professional reputations systematically destroyed. This coordinated campaign reveals the magnitude of institutional fear surrounding these discoveries. If the evidence validates biblical accounts of supernatural intervention in human genetics, it undermines evolutionary narratives that form the foundation of modern scientific authority. More disturbing still, it suggests that genetic differences between human populations might reflect supernatural rather than natural origins. The theological implications become even more profound when we examine how different religious traditions have interpreted the persistence of Nephilim bloodlines. While mainstream Christianity has largely abandoned literal readings of these passages, other traditions preserve detailed accounts of ongoing supernatural influence in human genetics. Orthodox Jewish commentary describes specific family lineages that carry markers from these ancient encounters. The Talmudic sources speak of bloodlines that possess enhanced capabilities in warfare, leadership, and spiritual perception, abilities that persist across generations regardless of environmental factors. These traditions identify certain populations as natural opponents of hybrid corruption, bloodlines specifically preserved to serve as guardians against renewed supernatural interference. Their role isn't passive resistance, but active detection and elimination of genetic contamination wherever it appears. Islamic sources provide similar accounts of populations carrying divine protection against supernatural corruption. The Quran describes certain tribes as chosen to maintain genetic purity, while others fall under the influence of rebellious spiritual entities. These accounts align remarkably with biblical narratives about protected bloodlines and corrupted populations. The consistency across multiple religious traditions suggests these accounts preserve historical memories of actual genetic warfare between different types of human populations. This wasn't simply spiritual conflict, but biological struggle for the preservation of uncorrupted human genetics. The modern implications become most disturbing when we examine recent advances in genetic engineering that could theoretically recreate the hybrid beings described in ancient texts. Scientific capabilities in embryonic manipulation, genetic splicing, and artificial reproduction have reached levels that enable the same corruptions that allegedly necessitated divine judgment in Noah's time. Consider the current experiments in creating human-animal chimeras, developing artificial wombs, and manipulating genetic expression in human embryos. These technologies represent unprecedented capabilities to alter human genetics in ways that mirror the forbidden practices described in suppressed manuscripts. Even more unsettling is the philosophical framework driving these developments. Transhumanist ideology promotes the same promises that fallen angels allegedly offered to antediluvian populations: enhanced capabilities, extended lifespans, and transcendence of natural human limitations through technological augmentation. The genetic markers we discussed earlier don't just represent historical curiosities. They appear to influence contemporary resistance to genetic manipulation and consciousness alteration technologies. Populations carrying these bloodline markers demonstrate statistical advantages in detecting deception, maintaining spiritual discernment, and preserving traditional values that resist corrupting influences. This explains why knowledge about genetic differences between human populations has been so systematically suppressed. If certain bloodlines carry programming that enables resistance to manipulation and corruption, keeping these populations ignorant of their heritage serves entities seeking to complete the genetic contamination process they began in prehistoric times. The prophetic accounts describe this final corruption campaign as more sophisticated than anything attempted in ancient times. Rather than direct physical intervention, the strategy involves normalizing genetic manipulation through medical treatments, pharmaceutical interventions, and technological enhancements that gradually alter human genetics away from divine design. The same populations that historically preserved divine knowledge and opposed supernatural corruption are now being systematically targeted through campaigns designed to promote genetic modification, consciousness alteration, and hybrid creation presented as medical advancement and human evolution. But the ancient texts also provide hope by describing how awakened bloodlines would recognize these deceptions and coordinate efforts to preserve authentic human genetics. They speak of a great revelation when scattered descendants would rediscover their true nature and activate dormant capabilities inherited from their righteous ancestors. This awakening appears to be accelerating through technological developments that enable genetic analysis and genealogical research. For the first time in centuries, individuals can trace their ancestry back to specific bloodlines while understanding the spiritual significance of their genetic heritage. Growing numbers of people report experiencing enhanced intuitive abilities, prophetic insights, and spiritual discernment that align with capabilities described in ancient texts. These phenomena occur simultaneously across different populations, suggesting environmental factors may be triggering activation of dormant genetic programming. The consistency of these experiences terrifies institutional authorities who recognize the threat awakened populations pose to established control systems. Rather than investigating these phenomena scientifically, mainstream organizations work to discredit individuals demonstrating enhanced capabilities while promoting interventions that suppress spiritual perception. The medical establishment's aggressive promotion of psychiatric medications that interfere with intuitive abilities. The educational system's emphasis on materialistic worldviews that deny supernatural realities, and the entertainment industry's trivialization of psychic phenomena all represent coordinated efforts to prevent activation of inherited capabilities. Yet the genetic programming these bloodlines carry appears to be awakening regardless of suppression efforts. The ancient prophecies suggest this activation follows divine timing that operates independently of human attempts to control or prevent it. The texts describe this awakening as triggering unprecedented polarization between populations embracing their genetic heritage and those accepting artificial modifications. The choice becomes increasingly clear between authentic human development and hybrid corruption disguised as evolutionary advancement. Those who recognize their true nature begin working together to preserve uncorrupted genetics, while developing capabilities that transcend current human limitations. They serve as living bridges between divine consciousness and material reality, fulfilling the role their bloodlines were originally designed to perform. The ultimate outcome of this genetic warfare will determine whether humanity evolves into higher consciousness aligned with divine purpose, or devolves into hybrid forms controlled by the same rebellious entities that corrupted antediluvian civilizations. Understanding these realities provides essential guidance for navigating the spiritual and technological challenges of our current era. The same conflict that began in Genesis chapter 6 continues in our generation through methods that have become more subtle, but no less dangerous to human genetic integrity. The evidence is overwhelming. The suppression is systematic. The awakening has begun. The question isn't whether these ancient accounts describe real events with ongoing consequences. The question is whether you're prepared to recognize your role in this cosmic drama and make choices that align with divine truth rather than supernatural deception. The forbidden knowledge of the Nephilim reveals the true nature of forces that continue shaping human development according to patterns established before the foundation of the world. This isn't just ancient history. It's the key to understanding your genetic heritage, your spiritual potential, and your responsibility in humanity's final chapter. The time for ignorance has ended. The genetic warfare that began with the sons of God and daughters of men reaches its climax in our generation. Every individual must choose whether they'll preserve the divine image within human genetics or participate in corruption campaigns that echo the same deceptions that once required global cleansing to correct. Your choice determines not just your individual destiny, but your participation in humanity's collective evolution toward either transcendent consciousness or hybrid enslavement. The battle lines are drawn. The awakening accelerates. The question remains, which side of this ancient conflict will you serve? Now let me show you something that will shake you to your core. The rabbit hole we've been exploring leads to one final, unavoidable conclusion that ties together every piece of evidence we've uncovered tonight. What if I told you that the signs of this ancient corruption are manifesting right now, in our lifetime, in ways that most people dismiss as coincidence or natural phenomena? What if the same patterns that necessitated global judgment in Noah's time are repeating themselves with mathematical precision in our modern world? Look around you. The unprecedented advances in genetic engineering, the normalization of human-animal hybrid research, the development of artificial intelligence that claims to transcend human consciousness, the proliferation of pharmaceutical compounds that alter brain chemistry and spiritual perception. These aren't random scientific developments. They're the systematic reemergence of the same forbidden knowledge that corrupted antediluvian civilization. But here's what makes this moment in history absolutely critical. For the first time since the flood, the scattered bloodlines carrying divine genetic markers have the technological tools to recognize each other, coordinate their awakening, and activate capabilities that have remained dormant for millennia. The same internet that authorities use to promote corruption has become the network through which awakened individuals find their true spiritual family. DNA testing reveals ancestral connections that were lost to historical memory. Ancient texts suppressed for centuries are now available to anyone willing to search beyond mainstream narratives. This convergence terrifies institutional powers because it represents their greatest nightmare: populations awakening to their true genetic heritage and spiritual potential before the corruption process can be completed. The choice we face isn't abstract or theoretical. It's immediate and personal. Every medical intervention, every consciousness-altering substance, every genetic modification being promoted through mainstream channels represents a decision point in this ancient conflict. Will you preserve the divine image encoded in your genetics? Or will you participate in the same corruption campaign that once brought divine judgment upon the earth? Will you recognize the signs of supernatural deception? Or will you embrace promises of enhancement that lead to hybrid enslavement? The bloodlines that survived Noah's flood didn't do so accidentally. They were preserved for this moment, for this generation, for this final confrontation between divine truth and rebellious corruption. If you've felt drawn to this forbidden knowledge, if these revelations resonate with something deep within your spirit, it might be because you carry genetic markers that enable recognition of these ancient truths. The awakening is accelerating. The polarization is intensifying. The time for neutrality has ended. You now possess knowledge that changes everything about how you understand human history, your own identity, and the spiritual forces shaping our world. What will you do with this revelation? Will you dismiss it as ancient mythology and return to comfortable ignorance? Or will you embrace the possibility that you might carry genetic programming designed to resist the greatest deception campaign in human history? The story of the Nephilim isn't finished. It's reaching its climax in our generation. The question isn't whether these accounts describe real events with ongoing consequences. The question is whether you're prepared to recognize your role in this cosmic drama and choose your side in the battle for human consciousness and destiny. If this investigation has opened your eyes to truths you never imagined, leave a comment below and let me know which aspect of this forbidden knowledge affected you most deeply. Are you beginning to recognize patterns in your own spiritual experiences that align with these ancient accounts? Do you feel called to investigate your own genetic heritage for connections to these bloodlines? And if you're ready to dive even deeper into the suppressed truths that shape our world, click on the video appearing on your screen right now. We'll explore how these same supernatural forces continue operating through modern institutions, secret societies, and global power structures that most people never recognize. The veil is lifting. The ancient knowledge is being restored. The final chapter of human history is being written. Make sure you're on the right side when the story reaches its predetermined conclusion. Remember, knowledge brings responsibility. What you've learned tonight isn't just information. It's a calling to recognize the spiritual warfare raging around us and within us. The same conflict that began in Genesis chapter 6 continues in our hearts, our families, our communities, and our world. Choose wisely. Choose courageously. Choose truth over deception, divine consciousness over hybrid corruption, authentic human potential over artificial enhancement. The future of human consciousness depends on individuals like you making the right choice in this critical moment of history. The forbidden knowledge of the Nephilim has been revealed. Now, the question is, what will you do with it?